Well, konnichiwa. So good to see you, Igor. So let me just do quick introduction. I will be doing an introduction post the recording, but just to set the tone, it's my pleasure and honor today to have with me Igor Kufayev. Igor is a spiritual teacher. He's an artist, an author, um, and he's a spiritual teacher who teaches from the traditions of Advaita Vedanta, Advaita Tantra, which we'll be discovering what that is, particularly from the transmission of Kashmir Shaivism, but he also draws upon from Sufism, German existential scholars, pre-Socratics, and also the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo. And yeah, he's a connoisseur of Japanese tea and Japanese culture and arts. So we'll be diving deep today. And thank you so much, Igor, for this opportunity and sharing this space with me today. Thank you.
Greetings, and I'm very, very thrilled to be here. It's been long in the planning, so I knew about this beautiful venture that you have started some times ago, and so I'm really, really with no expectations, but very much looking forward to the whatever might unfold.
I think, as you were mentioning, 2018 was the first time I had the opportunity to sit with you in Ojai, and it was very, very sweet. And um, we could perhaps dive in. I had the opportunity from our pre podcast conversation. We were talking about some very interesting things, which included the tantras and this idea of ascent and descent. And I was really, really enjoying that because that has become a very important part of my journey, also in relation to the project potential paradigms that I've been doing, and essentially how I'm sort of living my life right now. So we stopped on that note, and then I actually started to read your wonderful book called Camatkāra, which is an interesting word. So I have a lot of questions, and what I felt was that it was sort of apt and appropriate to come to this book because it really distills. It's a distillation of your own experience and really goes into many deep ideas such as possession by the goddess and the path of beauty, and this mystical idea of Spanda in Kashmir Shaivism, which is related to the prompt that we stopped at the last time, which was ascent and descent. So just to say that you being an artist, I really appreciated the piece of art that this book is, also at the physical level. The texture, the color, the perfume. I don't know if that was intentional, but even the smell of the perfume of the page. Um, yeah, so maybe that's one good place to begin, and also that I'm a student of Kashmir Shaivism, and it was a joy to read the book because although I feel like it's not a big book, it's a very deep, it covers so much territory. So I pause there, and maybe we can begin at what inspired you to write this book.
Well, truth be told, book wasn't really written as a lot of books come to light. It was rather a kind of a gradual assimilation of various discourses into potential book. So the whole project took place over many years. And it was also simultaneously accompanied by some other potential material that could have been turned into a book, which I thought would be more appropriate, something a bit more substantial in volume, in also resolve. But there was this sudden moment of intimate revelation that I went through. And I felt, since I've never really authored any books and being a visual artist most of my life, and kind of launching myself as an author, I felt the most honest thing is to really give the distilled sense of what it means to be the lover of beauty, what it means to experience this reality through the senses, and what is taking place behind the scenes of that seemingly obvious affair. After all, there is also, in spiritual discourses, there is this allusion to the machination of all that what perception is known for. Many spiritual teachers of the past and present speak of this in terms of the conglomerate, a machine of sorts. In fact, references are made like that, were made like that by some very notorious teachers of our time. And yet, what I felt also, and this is, of course, was a synthesis of what I have always intuitively sensed, without perhaps cognizing it fully, and what I gotten to know directly. So that confluence of my life as an artist, which is inseparable from my childhood, I could say that I've embarked on the path of a professional artist as early as the age of 12. I was given to the studio, private studio, to someone who became my mentor and then continued my studies. So the identity of being an artist whilst growing up psychologically was so fused that it was impossible to pull them apart. It was never considered a profession, a job, doing something. It was just a matter of fact, living it. And yet, with the dramatic changes around my mid-30s, when profound force took me over, and perhaps we can go back to it during the course of our conversation, there was a hold to that activity of an artist. In other words, the activity of actually producing works of art, painting, drawing, creating something. And after many years of integration, I've realized that the impulse to paint was no longer there, and instead I went to become a kind of instrument of what this whole thing as teaching spirituality is about. And inevitably, I've soon found out that the two intimately relate. So the Camatkāra as a book could be seen as that synthesis, paying respect, paying tribute to that what the entire life was dedicated to prior to this moment, whilst also an attempt at the very same time to reconcile seemingly impossible, to reconcile what I don't want to say was given to an exhaustive discourse or discourses, but rather giving some taste to what one can only experience within oneself. So in other words, it's not a book in that sense that one reads from cover to cover. I don't know what's your experience, but because it was assembled to begin with from the discourses delivered over a period of 2 to 3 years, and then that tossing and turning began when chunks were removed, transcribed, adopted for written language, expanded, and the final kind of sitting down and really raking through this and realizing that the book should have this emphasis. So a lot more was removed. So it slimmed down and became more of a allusions, insights. This, perhaps, if I may say, giving that sense through the fragrance between the words and what some of the passages may invoke in the reader. Yes, it also has in the earlier part of the book some of the foundational grounds of tantric teaching, because it would have been very difficult, nearly impossible, to delve into that what is often referred by scholars of Trika Shaivism, which how it is referred to in the scholarly circles. The Kashmir Shaivism is more of a populistic term. That creme de la creme of the Kashmir Shaiva teaching, which is exalted by some of the key masters of that tradition. So in order to speak to that, of course, some foundational ground had to be covered. So therefore, in Prakasha and Vimarsha, right, the aspects of where the Tantra really begins, the awareness and the reflective power of self-awareness, and the Spanda, that the quiver, the throb at the heart of Shiva, as with that poetic reference. So, and then of course, once that ground is covered, it was a sheer joy just to touch upon these aspects, the theory of rasas, the rasavada, and effectively speaking, reposition the reader, hopefully, potentially, into reevaluating what actually going on behind the scenes when we experience something, anything. But particularly rehabilitating the value of emotions as the theory of rasavada. And of course, that's why it was impossible not to bring that the foundational ground of all classical Indian arts in the Bharata Muni's treatise, right? So that it was, which laid the foundations for all classical Indian arts to this day, plays tremendous role, tremendous importance. So that's what this book really is about. And so it wasn't really attempt to come up with the first book. It was more like a kind of a paying tribute, giving it due in that synthesis of everything that I have known prior to the moment of putting it all under the cover. And of course, it's a collective work as well. Our whole team worked on this. So
beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that background of the book. My experience was really being also a student of Kashmir Shaivism and Sufism. To come to this book was really synthesis. I really enjoyed that, it being not a very, in terms of the weight of the book, it's not a heavy book, but as I was reading through, I was in awe of how you were connecting the dots, starting from describing this hidden path, which is also one of the chapters in the book, um, of beauty as a hidden path. And I think what's really valuable, at least to me as a reader, is you being an artist from very early on, as you were sharing, and also a spiritual adept, the combination of those two. And there are many, many deep subjects that you traverse in that, with reference to Kashmir Shaivism in particular. And I think the readers, I highly recommend this, because people often yearn, with as you were saying, the Shastras that Abhinavagupta talks about, music, art, and the path of, and this particular path of beauty and art. And what is the connection, often is mysterious. What is the connection of that to our spiritual journey? So this book is incredible to actually synthesize that, and also to draw those parallels. And it's very approachable. So really, thank you for bringing this forth.
Yeah, it was a great, yes, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. I will also have to reread this. This is one of the things that I noticed, that many of the passages invoke something deep within, and I personally felt that I would have to imbibe in it and marinate. Um, Particularly for me, when you speak of creativity becoming not just as an artist, but the human incarnation being providing that opportunity for being an artist by birth, or the purpose of our life being creativity. And how does that connect with the psyche? I could go on and on, but just very appreciative of it. And maybe we can dive in to beauty as the path. Um, I don't know if you mentioned the Sufi quote in the book, but the quote goes something like, God is beautiful and he loves beauty.
It's in the Hadith, yes.
It's in the hadith.
Yes, it's yes, of course, variously translated, but in essence, God is beautiful and He loves beauty. Sometimes He is abbreviated because it poses some a difficulty in understanding why it's being genderized, but that, in fact, line was a great candidate to be used as one of the poetic entrances, references in the book, but I've excluded it simply because it was used in some other essays on the topic. And perhaps it would be worth mentioning something so that those who are potentially hearing this conversation can feel more connected to why do we even speak about this, and why the beauty here needs any rehabilitation, and why the beauty is considered to be here and spoken of as that hidden path. If you recall at the beginning of the book, in the introductory parts, there is this a very brief outline, like literally streamlined outline, which begins with the Dostoevsky's metaphysical mentioning of the Trinity, the importance of that Trinity, the truth, beauty, and justice, that obviously wasn't invented by Dostoevsky. This is incorporated into his work richly from Christian theologians, and very much felt to me in line and analogous to what in Vedic tradition is spoken of as that Satyam, Sundaram, and Shivam, or could be said in different order. Shivam, Satyam, Sundaram, that trinity, that what stands here for, effectively speaking, almost on par with the same categories of what is exemplified in that truth as Sat, Satyam. In justice, perhaps he is replaced with Shivam as that auspiciousness of the Godhead. And Sundaram, adjective in Sanskrit as which stands for beautiful, beauty. And what of tremendous significance is the correlation between the experience of beauty and that, again, Vedic Satchitananda concept. That whenever any spiritual teacher today or yesterday, doesn't matter how radically, let's say, oriented their teaching, everything can be reduced to nothing. Everything can be reduced to, let's say, awareness. Awareness is the one and the only, this real substratum, the alpha and omega. And yet, there is also undisputable understanding among all teachers. It's like kind of an unspoken agreement. Though beyond all qualities, Absolute also is known to be Sat, Chit, and Ananda. So it's known to be as being, consciousness, bliss. And whilst the first two, being and consciousness, is not open to all, being is unreachable, abstract concept. Even though we all live being, and being is what is given, being is what gives and imbibes everything with the vitality of what we call this life. It is inaccessible. It's not accessible through the senses. It's not accessible through the mind. It's not accessible through any psychic parameters or dimensions. So being, as it were, as Maharishi Mahesh Yogi used to say, would have remained forever undiscovered, abstracted from reality, if not for the fact that consciousness here, that what stands for Chit, the fact that we are all conscious. So the consciousness rescues being. And that what brings tremendous joy, that what brings that ananda. So now, putting this now together in juxtaposing it with the aforementioned Shivam, Satyam, Sundaram, or Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram, Ananda here stands for what is tangibly experienced by every human being, irrespective of their level of consciousness. So in other words, if consciousness, if being is inaccessible and forever abstract, and the only access to being is through the fact that we are conscious. So being conscious gives us that taste, but that does not mean we taste being, because being here tastes itself. Through the fact that we are conscious, this is where spoken of in terms of being rescued, through the fact that it is conscious of itself. Yet that experience is not granted to the majority of people. It is a dim, supreme, secret, and rare, in fact, among those who have walked the path and dedicated themselves. And there's no need to really be shy about this and speak about it in somehow preferred, democratized way. Whereas beauty, as expression of Ananda, is available to absolutely everyone. So in a way here, that perspective, this is what I wanted to allude with this little book, is the beauty here, the experience of beauty is where direct access to our essence is given at any moment in time. So therefore, the argument is being made in the book, the proposition, the supposition, the suggestion, the invitation, that each time we experience beauty, in fact, we experience ourselves. We experience the essence of who we are. So therefore, it's immediately available, the most democratic, the most available to all experience. And yet, it goes unnoticed because by beauty we understand a lot of things, and we confuse preferences, we confuse acquired tastes and so forth with what otherwise beauty here stands for, because I felt also it was important to give dramatic examples of experience of beauty when we stand stripped naked in front of the display of the power of nature, in whatever way, which basically strips us bare of all the coverings there and then. So this is the most direct experience of beauty. Whether this is as dramatic, as cataclysmic event, or as seasonal as being holding witness to a powerful thunderstorm, a stupendous vistas that opens up somewhere, mountainscape, landscape, seascape, the dunes of the desert. These are direct, when we are put in touch directly with the essence of who we are through this shortcut into the nature of experience, where literally that circuit is closed. So we could also say that the attempt of this book is also to rehabilitate the quality of what beauty stands for from otherwise industrious use of that term in our day and age.
Yes, beautiful. Thank you for that very clear exposition. I am also um, beginning to, for some time, call myself an etymologist because I've fallen in love with etymology. And so, yeah, thank you for that very clear exposition of Satchit and Ananda, um, and then connecting it with what beauty is and why it is accessible to everyone. And here there are two sort of questions that come to my mind, or two prompts that we can take as paths. And one of them is, you were earlier talking about as you were talking about Satchit and Ananda, or Satyam Shivam Sundaram, being and our quality of being conscious, that being is being rescued. And I'm wondering if this is related to Prakasha and Vimarsha. Um, and then, of course, Vimarsha being connected to the possibility of having a creation. That is the first direction to consider Vedanta and its connection to Tantra. And you mentioned some of that in the book. And the second, perhaps, would be as beauty and the refinement of perception, that is a thread that you address in the book. So maybe we can begin with, would you say that Vedanta, in my understanding, studying Advaita Vedanta, that there was an emphasis on being, and that Tantra then takes you from towards Vimarsha, towards the bliss, and not just resting in being, but projecting you into creation. So I was wondering if you would like to say something about what do you feel is the connection between these two ancient traditions?
Well, philosophically speaking, of course, there is a tremendous difference because there is a departure made. And that departure is due to the emphasis, or rather, the emphasis due to the what can be as a proper means for, let's say, attainment. So Advaita Vedanta's emphasis is on renunciation, one way or another. We know this to be the path of renunciation. In fact, it's a path of renunciation par excellence, because Advaita Vedanta leaves no stone unturned when it comes to the juxtaposition of the world in relation to Brahman. So that, that coveted, much spoken of equation, the world is unreal, only Brahman is real, Brahman is the world. Here in Advaita Vedanta, indeed installs the supremacy of being, as Brahman here exemplifies, and the world is given the place of appearance only. And for a reason, because on the path of the renunciate, there needs to be a strong psychological conviction to leave behind this world of worldly attachments. Because if that is not achieved, then one would always be left with very undesirable dilemmas with regard to the goal is set. So, philosophically speaking, of course, these systems are complete and supreme, each in their own right, each in their own way. But in terms of, let's say, application, this is where it's very important to draw the distinction. So this distinction that the Tantra brings here is crucial, because it views the world not as an appearance in awareness, not even as a reflection of awareness, as, let's say, in the theory of Bimba Pratibimba, to which we can maybe return if there is a need, that the analogy of the mirror, the analogy of the reflection. But Tantra proper speaks of the world as an embodiment of awareness. So the world, the phenomenal existence, is in fact the body of awareness. So the world is therefore addressed and spoken of and referred to as the body of Shiva. So if we are to use that more kind of a Western vocabulary, that even if we lean towards that religious language, we literally live in the body of God. And we live in the body of God, therefore as God, because there is no other, there's no agency, there's no intermediary. So of course this may be highly blasphemous when it is spoken from the point of view of religious perspective and understanding. But that's exactly what many mystics of various respective traditions have alluded to. Some more directly, others in more poetic and metaphorical ways. So when we speak of the Advaita Tantra, which is a kind of an invented term, I don't want to take credit for it, but we came up with that some 10 years ago for one of the Science and Non-Duality conferences, where I simply thought, well, Advaita Vedanta is being everywhere. Why don't we just add Advaita Tantra? So ever since it got kind of like in circulation, and we kept it in in our own biographies and CVs. So from the point of view of Advaita Tantra, that relationship that prior to that was irreconcilable, the relationship between that and this, that what is exemplified by the Upanishadic verse, Purnamada Purnamidam, Purnat Purnam Udachyate, Purnasya Purnamadaya, Purnat Purnam Iva Vashishyate. So that absolute is full. This relative is full. From fullness, fullness comes into being. By fullness it is sustained, and into fullness it is being reabsorbed. What remains is fullness. So this relationship of the early Upanishad has been reinstated in very unapologetic terms by Kashmir Shaiva sages circa 10th century, and before that 8th to maybe 11th century, when some of the key figures of that tradition lived and walked the earth. So these postulates came very strongly through the Shiva aphorisms, the Shiva Sutras, through Spanda Karika, the authoritative text on the theory of vibration, and of course with many other work, Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, whatever there are, there are many scriptures but the principal ones speak of the indivisible reality of the absolute and the relative. So you've started your inquiry with the terms Prakasha and Vimarsha, which had to make their way into the Camatkāra book at the beginning so as to orient the reader. And of course, that all Tantra begins, you cannot study Tantra unless you go straight into this dyadic relationship. And that dyadic relationship exemplified by the union of Shiva Shakti. And that union of Shiva Shakti here is exemplified by Prakasha and Vimarsha. Prakasha is that quality of luminosity of Shiva. It's that what illumines everything. And Vimarsha, it's the reflective quality, self-reflective quality of Shiva as Shakti that throws its own luminosity back onto itself. So it's an act of self-awareness. So in other words, this is, to me, felt immediately much more precise relationship than, let's say, how back in the days in the non-dual circles, in Neo Advaita, awareness was spoken of only as one and the only reality. And how does this experience then relates to awareness, or how does awareness relates to this experience, was kind of given a smoky veiled view. Whereas in this relationship exemplified by Prakasha and Vimarsha, often I do this in the retreats by drawing that 8 of the infinity lying on its side, right? That shape. So it's awareness and the power of self-awareness, or luminosity and the power of reflecting that luminosity back onto itself. So it's 2 in 1 and 1 in 2. It's not that one gives rise to 2 and that what is given rise to becomes inferior. But the relationship here of Shiva and Shakti, speaking in tantric terms, is paradoxical in a sense that the dichotomy of the mind can have insights to that and direct experience of that. But to understand that, of course, it's a very, very difficult thing to do, because this is where a lot of people stumble, that they somehow feel, well, that's duality. What is then prior to? What is superior? Well, nothing is prior to, because this relationship is self-sustaining. Or another way of speaking about it, all experiences are with reference to the self. So in other words, the very quality of what is being experienced is experienced in the first place on the account of with reference to the self. So therefore, every experience is self-referral, not object referral. So this is in a way the very first steps in understanding how Tantra philosophy, metaphysical understanding, and utilizing the tantric teaching into one's daily life, because that's what it boils down to, because it proposes very different philosophical outlet for a householder, as opposed to the renunciate, for whom the Advaita Vedanta becomes that very, very guiding light, which helps to renounce the world. From tantric point of view, renouncing the world is impossible even. Why? Because the world is Shakti. So the renunciation of the world in itself is considered to be a kind of oxymoron. Traditionally, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean so in strict terms, because of course there are many tantrika sects, there were nuts, and there were many, many different yogis and were tantric teachings who were, ascetics who walked out of life, walked out on social strata of interactions into that asceticism. but it does not mean that it somehow creates the exposes. It doesn't mean that that exposes some holes in the philosophy itself. So therefore, the Kashmir Shaivism here comes at a great, very timely in a way as a philosophy itself. Timely back then, when it reappeared on the landscape of India, and timely today, now in our time, because this philosophy reinstalls the importance of this, what we consider to be this embodiment, this world, this life, these interactions, these relationships.
Yeah. May I ask you to repeat a sentence, which was you said that there are holes in the philosophy. You cut out there. So were you saying that there are holes, claims made to hold in the philosophy of Tantra?
No, what I meant is that even though non-dual Tantra, with this, what we just spoke about, meant to be a guiding light for the householder life, there are, of course, a lot of examples one can find there and then where tantric philosophy is being utilized by ascetics, by those who walked out on a social arrangements, who walked out on social interaction as it is known for in terms of the conventional forms of interaction. That doesn't mean that this shows holes in the philosophy itself. It's simply how it is applied. What I wanted to rather to highlight is that Kashmir Shaivism in particular gained its reputation for being known as the householder philosophy par excellence. So if the Advaita Vedanta is the greatest philosophy for renunciate, then the Kashmir Shaivism likewise is the greatest philosophical system of thought for a householder, because it constantly reaffirms what it means to be in a body, what it means to be in a relationship with someone in particular, because everything mimics here. In Tantra, there are continued mimicking of all this relationship that can be traced to that matrix woven out of these vowels and consonants of Shiva and Shakti. So that whole shimmering sound that the universe is as reverberating whole is, in a way, throughout its entire fabric, as awareness made manifest, reenacts itself in every human interaction, in every human drama, at a collective level, at an individual level, at the level of a tribe, family, nation. So every relationship here is a reflection of that. So this is, of course, this, in my understanding, brings tremendous confidence back into our experiences rather than living in that kind of shrouded in the mystery of vagueness of why this life, what this life, what's the purpose of this life, at the time when so many authorities, so many ideologies crumble down. See that the Kashmir, because Kashmir Shaivism, if we are to speak in kind of down-to-earth plain language, is known for being very practical, down-to-earth, monistic realism. No, monistic idealism. Not realism, but could be also turned around and called realism. But what it means is that it's a very practical philosophy, very applicable to daily life. Whereas it's questionable if Advaita Tantra is applicable to daily life unless one walked out on life.
You meant Advaita Vedanta. Yes. Wow, amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for this clear transmission. Many things come to mind. I love how you said the body of awareness, creation as the body of awareness. And I know that in Kashmir Shaivism, as you were referring to the vowels and consonants, the state of internal samadhi uh, without it pervading into creation is related to certain set of vowels and is not considered as a realization in Kashmir Shaivism, which would be a very, internal state, which did not pervade into the external. And you also talk about it, maybe that's a theme we'll touch on, where you talk about Samavesha versus Samadhi, which would be really great to dive into. You were also talking about this paradoxical connection between the one to many. And in my own journey and in the wider spiritual circles out there, I noticed that we have this tendency of wanting to pick one or the other. We have to reject the many to somehow prove that there is unity. But as you were also showing with your gesture of the infinity symbol or the Mobius strip, that it is a paradoxical, and it's both in a way awareness along with the body. I just love it how you give a physical body to awareness. Because otherwise, I feel it becomes an abstraction. Awareness becomes somewhere extracted out there in the mental sphere. So, would you say that this paradox needs any resolution? Where I find myself sometimes is that I don't need to resolve paradox and just let the paradox do what it needs to do.
The whole point of the paradox that it doesn't require resolution, because paradox is not a riddle to be solved. In fact, solving of the riddle is dangerous. If we are to bring the analogy of Oedipus Rex, that first most dramatic and tragic of all the Greek tragedies that the story of Oedipus exemplifies, with which all unrolled from the moment of him resolving that riddle, which caused the Sphinx to throw herself off the cliff, and him leaving then all that what unveiled itself as a destiny. So I don't want to go into the mythology of that, on the psychology rather of that, what Oedipus exemplifies here, because the Oedipus suffered this complexity of human drama brought to extreme. And maybe to the listeners, those who are not familiar with the story of Oedipus, which one of the early plays of Greek theater, but it's based on the character that was basically son of the king and brought out in a very different family. And at some point he wants to discover who his real parents are, sets on the road of discovery, leaving his foster parents, and on a way to find out who his real parents are, he meets his father in the chariot, and being confronted, he kills his father. Then, after some journey, he arrives to a place where the queen is being widowed because someone killed her husband, who was a king. She receives him as a guest and that fosters an amorous relationship between the two. So as the listener can guess, this happened to be Oedipus entering the affair, incestuous affair with his mother, not knowing that. And when he finds out what happened, of course, this leads to a dramatic death of his mother, the queen, who hangs herself, and he takes his sight off, he blinds himself. And blinded, he then, given that prophecy, to wander until he reaches the place where people don't know what the roaring, the roaring, what this ore is. So in other words, people who don't know what the sea is. So in the Mediterranean myth, of course, this is very, very difficult place to find because it's all around the seas. So, but this is the domain of the psyche, domain of the psyche. So the paradox here, represented by the riddle of the Sphinx, and so solving the paradox here does not necessarily makes us happier. So maybe that a long allusion that I gave with this the most dramatic of all the Greek plays, which set forth this kind of like ultimate sense of how we can be on a road to destiny, to find our origins, which leads to this, in the case of Oedipus Rex, incest and the killing of the father. And Jim Morrison was obsessed with the story, and we know that it was incorporated into his famous or infamous song, The End, where that Jungian psychology also was given, right? So why am I speaking about this? Kind of not to confuse, not to lose the listeners now. But because you've asked, is it about solving the paradox? And the paradox here that we all live, our life is already a paradox. But it's not about solving that paradox. This is where maybe a lot of folks in spiritual circles, when they embark on a journey, they somehow misplace the understanding of what this is all really boils down to. What is this all about? And so the seeking becomes that solving the riddle of the Sphinx. So many talks these days in that cross-pollinated territory of New Age and all these psychic powers, where we talk about our collective destiny, individual destiny. Are we better off knowing? Are we better off knowing exactly how and in what way do we relate and connect to each other? You see? So this invisible karmic interactions that brings us together, better to remain for what they are, to be experienced in this lifetime. People go and find out, I want to know who I was in my previous life. I want to know who my wife, who my children, what is the connection? And the emphasis goes there. Are you sure you want to really know? So in the same way, this analogy, one needs to understand what is the true purpose of spiritual enterprise, spiritual seeking. Because finding ultimately the answer of who we are can be a devastating experience. Devastating experience. And this devastating experience also can lead to a variety of side effects that would make one literally lose the plot of why one is alive and what one is to do here. We know this to be true. I have seen it and witnessed myself, in myself, the rise of these tendencies, how they play out, and in those in my immediate surrounding, when I, even before I ventured to hold space and to guide others, I have witnessed that with fellow finders, with fellow very gifted, very talented those who took the bull by the horn, and how it all, in many cases, played itself out quite dramatically. So, no, it's not about resolving the paradox. We are already a living paradox. So, it's not about solving that, but something else is hidden here. And that's what, in a way, the attempt through Camatkāra was, is to reintroduce that thread there, bring it back into the conversation. That so many times I've witnessed how the baby has been thrown out with the bathtub in the name of some spiritual realization. You see, so it's like, this is why you greeted me with konnichiwa, and why I've always been very intuitively drawn to traditions and cultures where spirituality and spiritual inheritance intertwined and interwoven into the fabric of the culture to such degree that you cannot tell them apart. You cannot separate them. So when it comes to Japanese culture in particular, it's a unique culture. All cultures are unique, we could say. But there are these aspects which takes experience itself to the level of pure art, to the level of gesture, performance, even when nobody's watching. In fact, not even. There's no need for anyone, because there's no need for the audience. The gestural aspect in the way the tea is prepared, the personal practice with the bokken or katana, the personal practice in terms of how one carries one's self in any given situation, has this kind of steeped in deep traditional understanding, that concept of ma, concept of space in Japanese culture. The space that is impossible to translate into English language. I don't know what other languages are there that operates with this concept, but certainly it falls flat on the ears when we start to give it an explanation of what ma means. It's a space. It's a space. It's a space of the bow of respect. It's a space left when something is arranged as a flower. It's a space left for when one is sitting down, so that there is this, everything that carries that concept. It's the most known concept in Japanese culture, and at the very same time the most elusive one. One cannot teach ma. One can only know ma. So in a way, this is what the paradox of being alive is. Because we are already that, an expression of being. So therefore, philosophy here is not to bleach something, sterilize experience from what otherwise would hide the God Almighty from its view. No, contrary to that. It is through this, that we can constantly reascertain that connection. And this is what, to me personally, deeply attracted in the teaching of Kashmir Shaivism. Particularly as I went into some of these aspects which simply gave me exhilarating insights into what was always known, but known without being fully cognizing it, even when those insights were aplenty in the creative process, or in the process of that creative agony when everything seems to be slipping away, and when that uncertainty has to be not just befriended, uncertainty has to become a principle of life. In order to create, if one leans on certainty, then maybe you can build a brick wall with certainty. But even the wall in Japanese culture has this aspect of beauty. It lingers and articulates the space rather than divides it. It's multifunctional. That wall serves during the peaceful times as what articulates the space, gives plenty of nooks and crannies for this or that activity. It blends with the landscape and gives that sense of continuity of nature into life. As you know, in Japanese art, nature is constantly worked with and from, not against. In times of the war, that wall becomes the fortification. It becomes the fort. It becomes the defense system. And so that it's not defined permanently. It's undefinable. It defies the language. It's always in accord to what is being experienced in a given moment in time. So in a way, to me, this is something that maybe one of the very important phase in spiritual endeavor of any sincere aspirant, any sincere seeker or finder, is to really somehow arrive to this understanding, and sooner better, so that not to kind of like let the life to pass by in idle kind of speculation of trying to outsmart that what already beautifully playing itself out here on our behalf.
Yes. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, thank you. And I like how your approach is unapologetic. It has helped me in my own journey to being at that phase where I found myself wanting to resolve this paradox and then eventually also separating myself rather painfully from friends and communities where it becomes like an echo chamber where the paradox is resolved, but deep within myself, I knew it wasn't. And that journey of iterations of becoming more and more comfortable that there is no need to resolve that paradox, but live it. It seems like it's a spiral that I feel like embodying that fullness that you were speaking of, the fullness from one side of that loop and bringing it into the constantly, consistently continue to bring it back. And I felt that your approach was very helpful to just kick me into the outer realm, into creation, and to live a creative life. And that as I find myself 2 or 3 years ago to finally take the plunge fully into the unknown, and making an inner vow, an inner commitment to creativity, the creative process applied to life, not to a creative art. Um, One of the Sufi quotes that got triggered in me with what you just shared is that the journey to God has an end, but the journey in God has no end. And I often refer to that internally to remind myself of this journey. And I also liked how you at one point said realism and idealism, and then you said that you could replace one with the other. I really resonated with that when you said it in the moment, because it could be either or, right? That itself is a paradox. And we have many philosophical schools or thinkers in our current time who want to take one approach versus the other. It's either realism, where when we get too attached to that, we have materialism. And on the other side, we have the Maya hypothesis, where it's idealism. And it reflects the cultural and political landscape we are in today, where we're very polarized in this. And somehow there is a mystical union of these two, which I think, as you allude to often in this, that how it actually reflects in how we live our life. And what I resonate with your spirit is that when we embody this paradox, we can really make a contribution as awakened beings in the world that we live in, rather than being in our room and doing our spiritual practice while the wars rage. Right. So thank you for that. A related theme, I think this has been great. So a related theme that I can check in with you here, is one of ascent and descent. So this is a theme that's taught in every spiritual tradition. We have, through ascent, I understand, we mean our aspiration to rise. And one way to look at descent is grace. And you talk about your book in that, on this theme of descent, that our spiritual journey is either, at one part it's ascent and the other part it's descent. But you can even see ascent. If you didn't have grace, you would not even aspire to rise. So I wanted to check in with you about this theme. But another way that I've been connecting with this theme of the descent is reincarnation, in a way, not just the reincarnation after death, but this fully returning to the source, which happens spontaneously perhaps, and then a re-embodiment. And each time that this re-embodiment happens, we are more joyful, we are more creative. And in my case, that, at least in one very powerful time, has taken the form of a near-death experience post a surgery. And I see that as descent. And this is also a theme that's become very common to the collective sphere, where NDE has become a common, thing that's discussed. So maybe we can dive into that a little bit.
Well, as you well aware, in some of the modern understanding that many spiritual teachers prefer to view this, that the concept of ascent and descent seems irrelevant, if not nonsensical, because awareness is all pervasive. So therefore, ascent and descent is being often marginalized in terms of what these two principal movements represent, because it's seen as only with reference to the body. So in other words, it's only with reference to the local experience. However, this is where Tantra is effectively becomes the science. There are aspects in Tantra as a philosophy, but Tantra also has this aspect to it, which is intimately related and can be spoken of in terms of its sister science as the alchemy. So because the ascent and descent here, to begin with, is the expression of two principal movements, even that of breathing. The breathing itself is governed by the descending breath of the apana and the ascending breath of exhalation as prana. So this descending and ascending principal movements of vital air and pranic currents is what, in fact, the anatomy of breathing. But in terms of that metaphysical perspective of the descent and ascent, this can be applied directly with that very same understanding. So And this is where we deal now with this very subtle changeability of roles and aspects as they begin to play and interact. I will try to elaborate this so that it's more accessible without making it too, let's say, flat or simple, because some may jump into conclusions. But let me give it a attempt at speaking it in terms of the feminine and masculine qualities. So, on one hand, the descent of grace exemplifies the quality of Shiva. So therefore it's a masculine quality, the quality of the spirit. And the ascent of power, ascent of Shakti, is an expression of the utmost feminine. So this descent of grace and ascent of power is really where that dynamics of real awakening proper, can be spoken of and is spoken of. And this is a subject, a very important subject of the next book I'm working on, entirely dedicated to the Kundalini. Kundalini as a philosophy, Kundalini as a concept, as a term, cultural term, supported by clinical studies, and what it represents really in terms of what awakening, when we speak of awakening, really is, as opposed to mental shifts, some profound insights, plenty of aha moments. There is also the direct and visceral alchemical transmutation, transformation. And this transformation is inseparable from these two grand movements. The movement represented by that what otherwise represents the ultimate masculine, the power of the descent, of grace. And it is immediately countered and in resonance, because that's what creates in the first place, that what prompts that response of the utmost feminine to rise. So, and yet at the very same time, the display of that is in reverse. So the descent of grace, though masculine as the expression of Shiva, expression of this, the descent of spirit, in itself is exemplified by the qualities which are qualities that can be spoken of in terms of utmost qualities of the mother, the utmost qualities of the feminine in terms of its manifestation. Whereas the ascent, though it's the ultimate expression of the feminine power of Shakti, is accompanied by the warrior-like rise of consciousness, where this changeability of roles taking place. Just as in terms of the internal anatomy, Kundalini, first in its dormant state, represents this in a state of homeostasis, represents these feminine qualities, whereas the spinal column and the sushumna, that central shaft, represents the masculine quality, that quality as the column, the quality of the verticality, represents these masculine qualities and the dwelling feminine qualities at the base of it. And yet these roles need to be changed. And this is the alchemy of the process, because in order for the awakening to really bear fruits, for it to really come up with goods, as it were, Kundalini needs to traverse that rise through the Sushumna. So Kundalini becomes erect, and the tradition speaks about it as fully awakened Kundalini literally represents that erected like a stiff, like a staff, stiff, firm, because prior to that, it's in a state of that, let's say, I'm not in favor of it, but we will give it a concession and speak of it in that Indian traditional way of a serpent. Serpent who is in a state of dream, homeostasis, it's all soft and coiled and sort of like resembles a mass. Whereas the serpent that is fully risen stands as cobra, and it has this really vertical position. So at that moment, Kundalini is ready to enter Sushumna. So the gender, the divine gender here, is now reversed. So Kundalini now begin to embody masculine qualities, and the Sushumna becomes that what is being penetrated. You see? So what prior to that was manifesting as and displaying itself as the quality of vertical dimension of that what here the Sushumna represents prior to that, is now changed the roles. It dilates. You see? It has to open up. Literally, this is the divine cosmic coetus. This is the reunion begins to take place. So the Sushumna dilates and becomes as a feminine in its connotations, literally. It opens up as a vulva, where the erected Kundalini, which prior to that represented feminine, becomes the embodiment of masculine. And the alchemy proceeds from there and then. So the descent and ascent has these qualities of changeability or interchangeability of that divine gender-like qualities that they display. And when we speak about this, we should, of course, bring this to very important understanding that descent of grace is what brings the power to rise, and it is proportionate. It is equivalent. So the stronger is the Shakti part, the stronger is the power of rising. And once that ascent is complete, once that ascent is fully complete, then after a repose, and this is again the beauty of that spiritual anatomy, of that esoteric anatomy that Tantra operates with, just as upon creation of this, upon manifestation, consciousness reposes as Kundalini at the lower chambers. It, as it were, reached the ultimate state of manifestation, whereby the power of self-transformation, awareness can be experienced as individual. And Kundalini is that what checks that experience of an individual. When that reverse journey begins and culminates in full ascent, it then also reposes. But it reposes at the opposite pole of that, what was prior to that, a repose in a state of slumber. And upon that repose, it begins its descent. It begins at descent. So that is the final descent. This is the final descent. This is what Sri Aurobindo talked about as divinization of matter. This is where the body becomes divinized. This is where every experience is then becomes the conformation of unity. If prior to that every experience was the fragmentation and driven by the fragmentation, now that very same experience is the reconformation of unity. So it's not just to be taken at a face value as a mental concept, what we spoke at the earlier part of our conversation, that every experience is in fact divine at a given. But now we speak about it, it is divine now, not just because it's divine in principle, it is divine in terms of its actuality. So, and this is why Adi Shankara's final sadhana and final work, right, the Sri Sundarya Lahari, the poetic invocation of Shakti, is known as the descent or the great descent, because it speaks to that. It speaks to the power of Shakti now reclaiming all the world. And it is reclaiming it through the invocation of what this now the sage sings the glory. So there is analogy, direct analogy between the sages. The sage who lived in the 8th century as Adi Shankara, who is by daylight was known as the most lucid expounder of Advaita Vedanta, but by every sunset he was a tantrika. He was the worshipper of Shakti. And another sage who lived at the beginning of the 20th century, some 12 centuries after, Sri Aurobindo, who in also his final work, Savitri, also sings hymn to Shakti. And all this, the conversation, right, that the revelations that Savitri experiences, right, Savitri and Savitr, how all this union, how that realization is then viscerally displayed and elaborated through the analogy of now how it gives that maybe stage by stage experience of complete and utter withdrawal, the samadhi, and how that upon that, it's then, once it tasted that samadhi, once it experienced that complete and utter absorption, it then asks itself, it checks everything and finds that, hang on a second, well, there is some separation because I'm separate from the world of the phenomenal experience. And so the descent begins now, so that it's now need to be reclaimed and the final gap is being bridged. So these two sages standing apart 1,000 years more plus speak to the same process, the process of the descent. And this is what Sri Aurobindo's work, in a way, why it's also, I feel, important, because aside from the tremendous influence that Sri Aurobindo as a philosopher sage, in terms of rehabilitation of the Vedas, and purely from that point of view, he was the first real who called to question the entire premises of Indology, how Indology was studied, and how the Vedas were viewed as just scattered, independent from each other. poetic expressions of this or that age, he argued against that understanding, against that treatment, that the Vedas are in fact not just some collection of lore of this civilization, but it's an expression of the divine orchestration, and all of the Vedas are interconnected. So just maybe before we continue, Kenan, I wanted to maybe go back to that ascent versus descent, and how this potentially is often dismissed in a lot of spiritual conversation, because the emphasis is always on, well, awareness is omnipresent, it's all pervasive, it's all there is. And so the reference point of a body, often given it as a kind of not just peripheral affair, but often insignificant quasi, let's say, obscure experience, because the senses here and the mind and all these instrumentalities rob us of who we are. But you see, that in itself is a very, very potentially erroneous understanding, because the body as a reference point precisely where everything taking place, and all our experiences are happening in and around the body. So therefore, for example, going back to when Muktananda was doing his work, and when he was rehabilitating the notion of mind, which was attacked a lot by spiritual teachers of his time, he simply stated, if not for the mind, there'll be no self-realization, no concept of self-realization. So the mind here is that as the moon, which reflects the light of the sun, and it has this soothing rays. It literally bounces off its surface. And so the moonlight, this is where the poetry of life. So before we debase the mind, we need to understand that even Adi Shankara, who, as was mentioned, was unapologetic when it came to the crystal clear discourses of his Advaitic expositions, Advaitic Vedantic expositions, he also was very clear in terms of, ultimately speaking, everything here is to bathe in the rays of the moon. So the alchemy of yoga is to be able to drink that soma, that lunar quality, that what oozes out of our own internal anatomy, as those soothing moon rays, moonlight, and that what confers the sense of immortality amidst mundane experiences, and that what also unites a simple folk and the highest sage, in a sense and in terms of that what is then available to savor. To savor. For the sage, it is continued reflection through the surface of that stilled mind, which reflects awareness now through the soothing rays and propagates the entire body. So this is, I feel, also an important contribution to the spiritual discussion, spiritual dialogues out there, and in terms of the what is the reference point and the importance of the reference point, because the body here is not, somebody who is declaring that I'm not the body, I've known myself to be beyond the body. Everything boils back to that what we experience here, whilst life force is in the body. So I just thought to bring that as a kind of a conclusive remark to that ascent and descent.
Yeah, thank you, Igor, for going so deeply and with such great clarity into this theme. Because, and I really wish that the listeners will be able to see the comprehensive and holistic nature of all that you're sharing. And Camatkāra is available to, if they wanted to um, go in a paced manner. So many themes you have shared with us in this theme, overarching theme of ascent and descent. And I have some reflections in my own sort of path, in the Advaita, Vedanta, or non-dual circles. At times, of course, Adi Shankara is considered the apostle, and often the name of Ramana Maharishi is used. And one of the themes that really became peculiar to me early on, I had an attraction at some level to devotional quality, somewhat, although my intellect was always very strong and I had a long-standing background in academia, which I have left for the past couple of years. But devotion was considered like a bad thing, and I kept on getting deeper and deeper into that. And what also did not make sense to me is that um, this devotional quality, as you were saying, with the descent of the act of worship in Adi Shankara, and you mentioned Sundariya Lahari, which I haven't read, but my understanding is it almost looks like a tantric text. And Ramana Maharishi himself has devotional hymns to Arunachala. So this quality that you were alluding to is there. And I've begun to feel now that even in the Western non-dual circles, there is perhaps, and I say that with humility, an element of colonial impact where a more holistic view has been colonized, and there is reductionism to reduce it. And yeah, that has sort of become more clear to me that that might be happening. So it is interesting because at so many levels, I come from the India, Pakistan, Kashmir region, and in my own life journey, I feel like there are so many steps we have to take to decolonize. It's so insidious and invisible. Um, uh, and you in your other videos you speak about that, and I'm so appreciative of that. And this perhaps to connect us with Sri Aurobindo's work, which has also been very meaningful to me. I've had a few conversations with Debashish Banerjee and the California Institute of Integral Sciences, where his work is really valued, in particular with our role as awakened human beings in the world. What is our role? And I think Sri Aurobindo's work really empowers. I felt an empowerment to find that there is value in doing that. And I don't know if you had any comments, but another reflection I had was the whole ascent and descent process that you described seems to me to be connected with the concept of this elusive spanda in the Kashmir Shaivistic tradition. Would you say that there is that ascent and descent is a description of spanda?
Can you maybe connect this together a little bit more?
Yes.
So that I understand where you come from in terms of why you brought Spanda now, as you spoke to Sri Aurobindo, and just so that I can see where you're coming from.
Yes. Well, for one reason, I know that Spanda is a mysterious subject, and I felt that your description was very apt to describe it in a way that it uniquely describes that process, at least in my mind, because often I try to grapple and understand what Spanda is, and in my own understanding, that process of ascent and descent seems to encapsulate that idea. So maybe I'm also just checking if I need course correction there.
I see. Well, since we've allowed that use of genderization, which tradition freely utilizes, it would also be helpful to bring this maybe distinction that within the body of various tantras, of what the non-dual tantra of Trika Shaivism is known for, there are, although these are monistic tradition, this is a monistic tradition, and within that monistic tradition there are different schools. So there are different schools. We can just mention for general interest of the listener, the most known of them are the Pratyabhijna, Spanda, and Krama. Respectively, they are Pratyabhijna as that direct recognition. We could correlate that to how it is today referred to the direct path, but I would not do that as direct analogy, simply to position the listener, because it's much more, I would say, nuanced and sophisticated. And Spanda, which stands uniquely between the Pratyabhijna and the Krama school. And the Krama school is the school which exalts progressive unfoldment. Krama literally means in succession, in sequence, in stages. So we have here direct versus progressive paths. So what makes Spanda unique is that with Pratyabhijna there is a clear goal, and therefore it representative here of that masculine quality of Shiva. So before maybe we continue, it would be helpful to bring this as a reminder that although monistic in essence, some of the expounding sages of Trika Shaivism were gravitating more towards that Shiva-based perspective, whilst others were gravitating towards Shakta-based perspective. There is absolutely no contradiction between the two. And very often the disciple of one master who may be exalting the path of Shiva would actually gravitate towards more of that where the primacy is Shakti, simply because the Shiva-Shakti union, the dyadic relationship here is exemplified in that infinity here. Shiva is Shakti and Shakti is Shiva. The one is two and two is one, or one in two and two in one. So therefore there is no contradiction. It's a simply a certain distinctive standpoint taken. So the Pratyabhijna school, the school of direct recognition, is more of that what exemplifies these masculine qualities, whereas Spanda represents more of that feminine quality. In other words, more Shakta oriented. And the Spanda here is not the goal. In Pratyabhijna, the goal is Shiva. The goal is self-realization. The goal is to realize that this Jiva is indeed Shiva, is to realize that this individual consciousness is universal consciousness. First, to realize that this individual consciousness is identical with universal consciousness, and then to realize that all there is universal consciousness, so therefore individual consciousness is universal consciousness in disguise. So there are stages in that realization. But there is a goal. This goal is exemplified in Shiva. Whereas in Spanda, there is no goal. There is no goal as such. Spanda emphasizes simply tapping to that what is here available through myriad of experience throughout, be they aesthetic in nature or joltingly in response to the outer stimuli. Let's say when we bear witness to some display of the power of nature, earthquake, a powerful storm, extraordinary sight, or as the scriptures go to describe sometimes the most mundane experience when we get up from a daily nap and suddenly we don't know what to do, not because of the boredom, simply we catch ourselves in that moment of we don't know whether we're coming or going. We simply find ourselves in that sudden gap where there is no propensity to remain, no propensity to go. And this is where one directly, as the scriptures say, savors Spanda. One tastes Spanda. Spanda here stands for that throb, that quiver. It's some form of movement, but it's not movement in the sense of how we speak of movement in a physical sense, because that quiver is at the heart of awareness itself. So, and of course, the teaching of Spanda is proceeds from this understanding that amidst the vastness of the expansion, there is contraction, and at the heart of every contraction, there is expansion. So that concept of the yin-yang as one contains the other. So in other words, every experience contains its opposite, diametrically opposite. So in this understanding that there is this continued waves, myriad of waves that ebb and flow as they crash at the shore of existence and back to the heart where these waves emanate from. So this myriad of waves run into each other, and that's what creates that shimmering field or shimmering ocean of sound, vibrations, that shimmering pool of light and sound. So that Spanda here is found on that what expands and contracts continuously. So this understanding here is what the goal in the Pratyabhijna is, to realize the identity with Shiva. Whereas in Spanda is simply to realize that this experience of Spanda, as the doctrine of vibration exalts, is what gives us direct taste of our essence. You see, so that there is a subtlety, and in a way, it's a distinctively unique way of within the tradition. And I personally always felt great affinity with that, because it also brought this plenty of reminders of how that was already known prior to anything. When we realize the essence of who we are, when that realization, when that cognition takes place, it's on par with remembrance, and remembrance only. And that remembrance is not in terms of seeing something new for the first time, is to recognizing that what we are. So this is what also Spanda here represents. So it can be invoked, and with enough, let's say, attention, because it's all at the quality of the attention, one can find oneself in Spanda at will, eventually, amidst any experience. Any experience. This will be on par with the Zen stories of a frog leaping to a pond leads to the realization of that particular master. Not the discourse, not the zazen, not the years of study. Simply something unrelated brings this direct cognition of the essence. The Zen is full of these stories, right? So it's like giving that poetic allusions. But we could speak about that. Analogy is in Spanda.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I also feel like I've developed an affinity for that, because that sort of goallessness that you speak of, I feel once you quote unquote transcend, you end up back here. And so then what's the point of transcending if you keep returning to creation? That's sort of my interpretation of my inner reality, and just being more and more relaxed to that there is no goal to seek. And it's also paradoxical, because that throws you more into this cosmic exploration and living life as fully as you can. Doesn't seem to eradicate pain and discipline and hard work, but yeah, that's part of it, and that also gives joy. So thank you for for making that more clear. Maybe to an earlier theme that I didn't question, that I posed to you but didn't pose it correctly. Maybe to reflect together on, do you think that part of uh, the dismissal and seeking a goal, particularly in non-duality, has some reductionistic or aspects of colonialism, which is just endemic in our collective civilization? It's, at least to me, it's becoming a little bit more clear. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
Well,
Put you on the spot.
I am sure you are aware and how much I have spoken about this, so this is why I'm posing, so as not to repeat myself and
Yes.
not to follow into kind of like a certain patterns, and I don't want to start sounding like speaking from that place of constant critical assessment. But there is definitely something to that what could be spoken of as the remnants of intellectual imperialism, which is the inheritance of the colonialism per se, but it is much less detectable when it comes to the domain of cultural enterprise, because it's not very, very clear where and how certain uniquely, let's say, unique expressions of how consciousness expressed itself in a particular way in a given moment in time, in a certain culture, through certain culture, is being then interpreted by some of the, let's say, those who feel they are in a position, and they are in, well, have the right platform to speak on behalf of these traditions. We know this poses big problems today because at the very same time, this has been acknowledged, and so that there are lots of new, there's a whole pleiad of younger generation of scholars growing within respective traditions where they see this as their responsibility to rehabilitate the traditions into which they feel they are belonging to, even through that kind of DNA connection, cultural connection, to free it from these colonial interpretations, these attempts at categorizing. This is what I've referred to when speaking of Sri Aurobindo's great input, is to question the Indology as a science. And we know that happened within the traditions itself. We know that there were exemplars of those who have been initiates into respective traditions to such degree that they became the embodiments of that tradition, even though they came from outside of the cultures, or born outside of the cultures. Those rare examples, of course, they rather confirm the rule rather than defy them. And this can be observed, that tendency also, the tendency to simplify and to strip traditional approaches and understanding to what would, effectively speaking, adhere only to one aspect, and mental, let's say, sphere is where the Western, where we can speak about it endemically, to understand everything in very rational, direct terms. So these attempts were done constantly by scholars and by practitioners, and also by the army of seekers who are out there to shortcut straight to the cherry picking of what tradition may be offering here, because they feel they're privy to that, because somehow we live in time, in a day and age, when this is granted. If I'm born into a middle class, relatively comfortable setting where life affords the possibility of this spiritual seeking, then naturally, why would I question my the legitimacy of being given access? And I'm now speaking about it, including myself here. So it's not I'm speaking about it exclusively. It is a phenomena. It is a phenomena that today we can study and partake in anything we want. We can change costumes. We can change costumes as easily as we decide what we want to enjoy for a supper. Do we want to have a Japanese, or do we want to have Indian? Do we want to have Italian? So this also is part of the cosmopolitan aspect of life today, affords this possibility. So now, perhaps more than ever before, right? Like I travel in Europe, and so you could have great ramen in Vienna, in Zurich. You can have great ramen in any European city. And have certainly Vietnamese, Singaporean, like any variety of Asian food. So why would that be restricted to food alone? So of course this is open to all that what goes for mental nourishment. The problem comes here, of course, with food. It can be prepared authentically. Maybe not as authentically as the true art of noodles making, even based on Miyazaki films, the anime, the great, how he portrays that nostalgia of the days gone by, how these noodles were prepared in his own little hometown when he grew up. I'm talking about the great Japanese anime maker, Miyazaki. The quality of water, the quality of wheat, and how it is done by hand. I grew up in Uzbekistan, as you know. So, I mean, there's a great, very rich cuisine which incorporated into itself, being heirs to the Silk Road. There are so many influences that have been incorporated into its own cuisine. Iranian, North Chinese, Dungan, Uyghur, Manchurian, Mongolian, Russian, so many different influences that have been incorporated. So, of course, when it comes to food, we can enjoy that meal in a much more authentic way. When it comes to the spiritual nourishment, this is not as straightforward. Simply because already the propensity is to withdraw, remove, I don't want to use the word castrate because it may sound unpleasant here in the metaphorical sense even, but sanitized maybe from aspects that seem to feel less palatable to my desire to get to the point. And in fact, get to the point, I often hear from those who follow a YouTube channel, people who want to have a rational explanation. Why to beat about the bush? Get us the straight answer. You see, so this is where it makes me wonder if this is indeed on a level of some kind of psychological impediment, that we want to have a quick, instantly made meal and we want it to be nourishing. But it is not nourishing. And if we're honest, because it's instant, it's made out of the packet, often prepared already. So that engagement at that level is already bereft of a lot of factors. So of course, the steeped in the butter of, fried in the butter of knowledge, steeped in the honey of love, as Paramahamsa Ramakrishna exclaimed, is not necessarily always is the case. But this is very, very important, indispensable part of all Oriental traditions, that where the aspect of devotion is accompanied the highest understanding. So devotion itself here is not some soapy, over-emotionality. Devotion here is, in fact, a sign of a highly refined heart. Devotion is the quality of the heart. And it comes out of tremendous discipline as well, commitment. And combined with all these other qualities of acceptance, surrender, then it really becomes a tremendous force. So, I don't know, I'm the last person to really to speak about this in a sense, because I have given so much attention and time, particularly in the earlier years, in terms of that propensity for sterilizing the teaching, stripping it bare of any nuances, where the teachings then seems to be palatable to the tongue of the consumer who wants to have an instant access, is detrimental in the long run, even detrimental there and then, because it gives one a false sense of authenticity of one's own experiences, you see. It often reconfirms that what actually meant to still be cooked. It reconfirms that what is now being in a boiling pot is ready. As Rumi explains, no, back to that chickpea that jumps out of the pot, you're too hard, you're too crunchy, back into the pot. You know, you cannot be made into a nice kind of like, offering. Sweet and tender and soft and juicy, it needs to be still given that. So, yes, it's hopefully that kind of insight is there in someone who has been around the block, realizes that, well, no shortcut would do. In fact, there's no shortcuts per se. They are supplements, like something that pretends to be, and then when it is consumed, it leaves us undernourished. See?
Yeah. Yeah. No, thank you. And I think you have spoken about it, and it's quite amazing that you were speaking about it more than a decade ago almost. And I think the field has started to shift quite a bit now.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, there is a greater propensity for. I can see that even in some of the teachers, like real key, great teachers, by the way, who have mellowed and allowed much more apologetic approaches in the responses and the engagement, and there is less radicalism, and there's a less as a result of that dismissal. So that definitely the climate is changing. So hopefully that also brings this. What also very encouraging is that young generation, and we started having these waves of very young people into the work, and they're amazing. They don't come for shortcuts. These guys, they just like I'm never really cease to be amazed each time I meet and sit in front of this just barely 20-something, and the quality of the inquiry and and the readiness is there. It's like it's much more inspiring than being around the jaded seeker who just begs for final answer because it's tiring to seek, you see.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's reflective of, as I've been studying the wider culture, and you give so many analogies of simplicity, and in the academic circles, materialism itself is a is a form of reductionism, right? And it just sometimes reductionism is good if you're just using it as a tool to study. It simplifies things, but if you just stick to that, then it's a form of rejection of what reality is. And during the conversation, I think, as you were alluding to, the tantric path, that it's not one of rejecting creation. And yeah, so thank you for that. And one of the themes with this that you talk about in the book is Samavesha, which one meaning is possession, right? And that is sort of connected with, I think you said in the book that we're always possessed, which is something I deeply sort of resonated with. And so can we dive a little bit into this deep theme, because it also connects with the
Sure.
samadhi and the difference of samadhi and samavesha.
No, by all means. In fact, the forthcoming theme of the immersion that we are now going into in just less than 2 weeks' time in Poland is going to be dedicated to Samavesha. It's a week-long program. And it's also a subject of the third book as well, because this Camatkāra is seen as the part of the trilogy. Camatkāra followed by Kundalini, and the third in the trilogy meant to be Samavesha. So we're already gathering the material for that. But in the Camatkāra, the concept of the term Samavesha is introduced only briefly, as a more in a passing by kind of way, simply to point out that Tantric Shaivism views spiritual methodologies not in exactly the same way, or spiritual states rather, how, let's say, it is seen in a sister science like in yoga. In particularly the Patanjali yoga is given as an example. In the Patanjali system, samadhi is what leads eventually to the state of that desired state of aloneness, that kaivalya. So samadhi is, in a way, literally that what's supposed to deliver us. Samadhi is where the samskaric seeds are being roasted as well, made impotent, which is true. So samadhi is exalted. The state of samadhi in yoga is exalted. However, Tantra views, Shaiva Tantra that is, views samadhi in the way that the state corresponds to the deep state of sleep. So, and that is considered to be not enough for the completion of what that whole ascent of consciousness and self-realization is known for. Instead, the emphasis is placed on the process of Samavesha. And in this particular work, I am making an emphasis on the three aspects of how Samavesha is known and translated, whenever it is translated, from Sanskrit. So there is Samavesha as immersion. This is why we call our programs immersions from day one. We customize that term, and you can find that now a lot of people out there, in fact, use that term. But some 12, 15 years ago, nobody called that. We called our first program already in Mount Madonna in California back in 2013, that, immersion. So the immersion is one of the meanings of Samavesha. Another meaning of Samavesha, how it can be interpreted, is penetration. And particularly this is how it is spoken in terms of the triple penetration as expounded by Abhinavagupta with regard to the process where the upayas, the means, are being employed. So the triple penetration here is literally to indicate its connection to the individual. Shakta means Shakta-based and Shiva-based, so it's a triple penetration. So literally we begin from the level of individual, where Shakti takes over, and it is completed at the level of the highest penetration, known as the penetration by Bhairava, in other words. So this is the term as penetration. And the most controversial, most exotic, unusual meaning of the Samavesha is possession or repossession. So this is where the allusion and the emphasis made in the book, in the Camatkāra, what you are also referring to, both with regard to the superior quality of Samavesha in comparison to Samadhi. So according to Kashmir Shaivism, the job is completed through Samavesha, not through Samadhi. So one can spend many years in Samadhi, constantly returning to Samadhi, not uninterruptedly. I meant having access to Samadhi, coming out, acting again back into meditation, Samadhi, until this Samadhi will become more of a spontaneous kind, right? But that in itself is not enough to bring the desired state that is here referred to, which can only be achieved through Samavesha. Why? Because Samavesha here is inseparable from complete and utter being taken over by the power of Shakti. So in other words, this taking over is here what completes the job. So therefore, from the point of view of Tantrism, that it is an act that is performed consciously once there is a fully active, fully awakened Kundalini, and the possibility for that is there where that transformation begins to take place by virtue of being taken over. And that's what it's called repossession, Samavesha. Yes, there are also mentioning were made that possession in itself is a quality of consciousness. We are always possessed by something, whether we are aware of it or not. So the whole difference here, or what makes the difference, is whether we are aware of it or not. But one way or another, there are these fields. There are these fields that claim these fields in the collective consciousness. Like one becomes a fan of football, and one thinks, well, this is just because I love football. But you see, underneath that, there is a power. There's the power that one is being claimed. One can be possessed by so many things. One can be possessed by, obviously, substances that one indulges into. And at some point, one consumes these substances, and then comes a critical point when one no longer consumes the substance, but when the substance begins to consume the consumer. And this is already the possession taking place. So this is the, let's say, what was spoken at the level in the Camatkāra. As I said, it was just given that introductory, more of a passing by commentary. And this is why I feel that it's a worthy subject of dedicating a whole work to it.
Yes. Yeah, that'll be lovely to take a deeper dive in another book. I like it. It's such an important theme because in the tradition of Sufism and in Tantra, of course, in Tantra there is many deities, and the process as a tantric practitioner is mysterious because you are also invoking the deities within and without, which is also a trait in all indigenous traditions, such as shamanism. Many shamanistic traditions have this very animistic. There are deities in nature and elsewhere, and there are exorcisms that are performed. Even if you're not a practitioner, you might be possessed by anger or greed or other qualities. And I think it bridges these, as you were mentioning in the book, the subtle and the gross realms. And so it can be dismissed, and I like this clarity that you bring, that we're always possessed, and we have to pick and choose what we are possessed with, at least in terms of our practice or my practice. It is mysterious that I'm invoking these energies from within, and I think maybe to check with you, you mentioned a quote of the Walking Universe. I think you have this quote that we are the embodiment of these energies, and each one of us embodies the full spectrum of these energies. Also, in Tantra, they have the Sri Chakra or Shiva with the wheel of energies. I find it deeply fascinating to reflect on this possibility that I am the universe, not figuratively, but literally. So, would you like to take us a little bit into this mysterious realm? I know there's a book coming, but I was wondering if you would like to add something to it.
We have already mentioned the importance of Sri Aurobindo in rehabilitating the Vedas from just being interpreted as lore of a particular culture, imagination, or stories born to imagination. And this work was continued by His Holiness Maharishi Mahesh Yogi to bring it to its conclusive understanding, where all the Vedas were brought into that understanding how the body itself, the neurophysiology, the human body, is an expression of the totality of knowledge, which is Veda. That's what the term Ved stands for. Ved, or Veda, is literally that how the knowledge, how consciousness, literally, or knowledge structured through the physiology as consciousness, throughout all its respective compartments. So there are 40 Vedas, and each of the Vedas correspond to a particular aspect of our neurophysiology. This has been culminated in the work of Dr. Tony Nader, who in the early 90s, under the guidance of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, came up with that magnificent work, where he allocated, and he is a neuroscientist by education, he allocated each of the Vedic sounds, because they are also sounds. Each of these Vedas are carrying particular sound. Each of these Vedas have name to a particular aspect of our anatomy and physiology, so as to show the true meaning of man being cosmic. If prior to that we could find this analogy being used in this tradition, in that tradition, we can find this being spoken in semi-mystical way, and spoken about it with kind of through metaphor. We can find these allusions in the Tree of Life in Kabbalah. We can find this in the Adam Kadmon. We can find this in anthropomorphic Purusha of the Indian culture itself. But if we speak about it, so how all this sits together? How are we then, and what are we? If, let's say, this proposition that Aham Brahmasmi, I am absolute, I am awareness, how does that sit in terms of the possibility of even that coming to the realization of that pronouncement, either through that what is the driving force towards that, or direct, suddenly unasked for act of grace. There must be something that is at work, at play, that is not just a mental construct, but actually structured through the body for it to become a possibility. Because we know today from neuroscience that we now stand at this understanding that the body and mind, as I gave this analogy more recently when speaking to someone, I was looking for what would be a fitting analogy of the relationship between body and mind, because they're one. And then what came to me is that in arts, this is given as music is architecture made alive, and architecture is music crystallized in form. So that relationship, music and architecture, can be spoken in terms of mind and body. The body is a crystallized, morphed music of the mind, and mind itself is the architecture in motion. So you see that this understanding revolutionizes our understanding of the body per se. With all this, what has been now enriching these overall dialogues from Deepak Chopra's and Menas Kafata's "You Are the Universe" to Dr. Joe Dispenza's "You Are Placebo," right? This work where repositions us into this understanding that everything is in fact psychosomatic and somatopsychic. So if we come to this understanding, then the question rises, so how can consciousness literally be cognized here? There must be something within the very domain of the structure of our neurophysiology that makes this into a possibility. And this is where that work of Tony Nader, inspired by the teachings of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, which is a culmination of all these attempts at stripping all these countless and endless interpretation of the Vedic civilization from this, what we have loosely kind of dubbed as the colonial or imperial, intellectual imperialism or intellectual colonialism. So, and the neurophysiology of a human being is an expression of sound. It expresses itself, and that's what Veda is. So every part of our neurophysiology here is a vibratory field that corresponds to a particular Vedic sound. So this is the essence of Vedic civilization, because it's sonic. It's with the essence of Vedic civilization is with an emphasis on sound, vibration, frequency. So, so going back to what you have kind of brought out in terms of this and how that can be linked to the process of in Tantra understood as archetypal forces. Archetypal forces. So these archetypal forces, they are the archetypal forces as the foundational units of how the universe itself is structured, how consciousness structures itself through these units, and how then everything that we experience individually at an individual level is the expression of these very same archetypal forces down to emotional content, down to the expressive potentiality of all this, what we speak of as the full spectrum of our emotional interactions. So the walking universe here is literally that. It's the fractal, where it's ad infinitum. We cannot reduce this. It constantly reproduces itself ad infinitum in terms of the patterns that it is created out of, and how these patterns are being the patterns out of which it is made at this infinitesimally, incomprehensibly fine level. So in a way, this what kind of rehabilitates our status. Also, of course, for some people this sounds like a very tall call, and well, yes, it sounds all very marvelous, it all sounds beautiful, and perhaps elevating, perhaps extraordinary, but where does it leave me? I'm like going through life with my own dilemmas, with my own ups and downs, making through life, right? So this kind of when the rubber hits the road, as it were, is also in itself can be given as a confirmation that everything boils down to the level of consciousness that is available to us to apprehend any experience. Nothing else there is a measure. Nothing else can act as a measure. So our own divinity, as it were, or our own greatness is only overshadowed by our own greatness. So we cast our own shadow. There's no other object that casts the shadow. So this is why in Tantric Shaivism it's spoken of as the first step equals to the last step. So one doesn't arrive to the radically new understanding. One arrives to the understanding where one began the journey. If one is being given that, let's say, a proper teaching, a proper orientation. So that's what the last equals the first equals the last step. So this people complain, people want to find what abstracts them, what causes this, what's the dilemma, where's the problem, or that now is the whole conversation on trauma, because that trauma, that's what abstracts me from knowing myself. Well, you are placebo, as Dispenza suggested. And see, not there is a placebo, you are. So this is quicksilver-like. It works constantly. It's constantly malleable. So one can experience oneself as this thwarted by circumstances, insignificant human. And also at the very same time, there is a possibility of experiencing oneself as unraveled across the universe, as what's her name used to say, one of the Sufi mystics, and both venerated by Hindus. And
Kabir.
No, the female one. Not Lala, it's another one, unraveled across the universe. I forgot her name. Rubaya? No. It doesn't matter. It'll come. It'll come. Yeah. So these are these very same forces, the very same forces that causes the contraction, the very same forces that work at the pranic level, are the very same forces that unravel us across the universe when we feel that all-embracing, all-encompassing qualities beyond time and space, when we are unimpeded. All this is experienced by the very same forces. So, of course, we become inadvertently, by hook or by crook, worshippers of this or that form of energy. And the difference here is, what makes all the difference is whether there is awareness and understanding. Because if we don't, then hopefully something works on our behalf, something generated here, that we are fallen, let's say, prey to the energies that are uplifting our soul, uplifting.
Yeah. Yeah, this is amazing. I mean, one of the words that I wanted to say, and you sort of caught my thought, was fractal. And I find that very empowering, that we are the embodiment of the universe. As you, at the very beginning of our conversation, you gave awareness a body, right? And so it also gives us much more responsibility. I think it's easier to say, oh, the world is an illusion. And often when I would be sitting in a meeting like that, the question that later comes to me is, okay, if I say that statement and it was authentic there and then, I should disappear the moment I say that statement. But that doesn't seem to happen. The other thing that you were alluding to is, in all spiritual traditions, the basis of creation is sound, which is mysterious not to claim. I love sound, mantra and classical music. And I heard a definition of these deities in the tantric tradition, that the Sanskrit alphabet, the deities are embodiments of the alphabet, of the matrika and the vowels. And so then we cannot just dismiss this possession, the Samavesha, because I'm not an authority to speak on this, but to me it seems like that it is the skillful means. It is taking responsibility of creation to play with these energies, so to speak, to fully embody them. I also like this theme, and maybe to reflect this with you, is I feel like this understanding of possession makes the world that we live in today simpler, because we have this turmoil, we have wars going on, and when I apply this understanding, things become simpler, and the way to act, what is the correct way to act, seems more straightforward than, again, recoursing to rationalism to figure out who did what and what's the strategy, but to see it at the level of uh, these demonic versus more conscious energies, more conscious deities, so to speak, and to solve, perhaps the solution lies at that realm, at that subtle realm, rather than endless debates, which seem to be going on for, I don't know, centuries. So, and you do touch upon that. I thought that it's so distilled in Camatkāra, but you're saying that there's going to be a deeper reflection in an upcoming book.
Yeah, one hopes. It's something that, again, have been alluded on many occasions, and certain discourses began to be born. So that's where it feels simply, well, I don't know. I'm just saying, but I said it's trilogy, and it's not a kind of almost contradicting myself, because I said at the beginning of our conversation that Camatkāra was not a book. So obviously, at the time when Camatkāra was coming into some form, that idea of trilogy wasn't there. But it seems simply as a kind of has the propensity of its own. So it unfolds now. And to me, it also feels somehow, perhaps, has this, well, yeah, dare I say, unexplored territory, that there is a lot of novelty in that, at least to those who haven't ventured into this, haven't pondered on this, haven't had insights. Yeah, there is a lot of talks, and there are a lot of beautiful books out there on tantric deities. And there's a whole generation of scholars who dealt with this, who brought amazing work out. You know, David Frawley, like Dr. David Frawley wrote about this, right? There is many Indian scholars who have, well, Mark Duchkovsky, not so, well, I don't know, Mark Duchkovsky didn't really write, did not really dedicate work to specifically to the deities. He was kind of more focused in the sense of his work. Like his latest work is by the way, is happens to be on my desk, and I can't resist not to show it, because I think it's only paying tribute to this great scholar who is, in his senior years now. So this is the Tantra Loka of Abhinavagupta. This is 4 volumes of these very, very heavy books.
Mm-hmm.
So
one of his other books that I've recently come across, not books but works, is the Kubjika Tantras, which is sort of lesser known, but it's available online. I don't have it, but it's his encounter with the hidden deity in India. And anyways, that's sort of one.
Yeah, it's absolutely you spot on. Very, very, very good addition, because that is a unique one in otherwise very, very distinctive scholarly output by Mark Duchkovsky. You know, like his translation of the commentaries on the Shiva Sutras, right? It's a really foundational text, and his, I think, debut, which is hard to believe, he wrote it when he was barely in his 30s, The Doctrine of Vibration, which I still think one of his best books. You know, it's so authentic, it's so it's so charged as well, you know, and the language, it's so lucid, it's beautiful, it's rich, it's like. So, but going back to this, so there are books, there were works on deities, whereas Samavesha is something else here. Samavesha will be spoken from these 3 principal meanings that each of these aspects represent, as penetration, as immersion, and as possession or repossession. So yes, the qualities of that possession can be seen here also, that the process of repossession is in fact, all spiritual unfoldments are inseparable from the process of repossession. It's when we are repossessed from that tight grip of that what we became subjected to as universal consciousness, individualized, coagulated to this experience of individual. So in Tantric Shaivism, there is no such thing as blaming ego or blaming circumstances. This is not spoken in this sense. It's a monistic, so the one and only to blame is one's own self. So there's only one cause in all, and that cause is in Shiva, in nothing else. So in that respect, the monism of Kashmir Shaivism can be closely related to the monism of Islam, even though Islam, of course, is a religion. But in essence, Islam is a timeless way of submission to the will of God, if we are to translate that, how the scholars speak about this. So the Sufi, the inner dimension of Islam, is very much, and we can find these allusions as well, because that the schools and various teachings and teachers and all these doctrines, they all came at around the same time, when there was a tremendous influx between various traditions disseminated through the aforementioned Silk Route, when many of these wandering Sufis, these wandering dervishes, were moving between the countries and carrying the seeds of teachings and depositing them in this or that geographical location. So the Kashmir Shaivism itself, the revival of Kashmir Shaivism, is inseparable also from the richest, historically speaking, time of the formation of some of the greatest Sufi orders. So that monism here, that there is no individual per se, it's only individual as awareness in disguise of. So of course this gives the responsibility straight back to oneself. So this is, in a way, this how to overcome this religious predicament that we are stuck in now, seems to be century upon century. Each one wants to claim the supremacy of their God, or the supremacy of the interpretation, or the right to interpret God. It's ridiculous. Not just ridiculous, it's also leads to all sorts of bloody conflicts, at least as one of the propelling forces. Culprits may be found in other areas, greed, insatiable desire for gratification, for power, domination, and so forth, but fueled by this religious fanaticism, which is rooted in that, effectively speaking, ignorant understanding of the real meaning of what the term Allah, Yahweh, Shiva here represents.
Yeah. What is also interesting is that Sufism itself, at least in my experience, is very tantric in a way, not to make them equal, but there are many parallels. Sufism or Islam has the divine attributes as the archetypes, perhaps, instead of deities, and in the Abrahamic traditions, different prophets are considered as recognition of different aspects and qualities, which perhaps in the contemporary man, there is an opportunity for integration of these various aspects. And this perhaps has some parallels to these very many deities. One other aspect, just to kind of show the depth of this topic that you have introduced in the book, Camatkāra, is you briefly mention about this confluence of the immortals and the mortals through this process of Samavesha, where the subtle realms of deities interface and live through the human form, and there's always a battle happening of these conscious aspects and the unconscious aspects. So I just wanted to highlight that if people want to dive into, there is that aspect as well, which I think is very reflective again of where the world is today, and a different way of looking at how to solve, or not to solve, but how to address and where to address these issues from.
Yes, we all propitiate something, and that something is not just some inert something. We always propitiate some forms of energy. And ultimately speaking, of course, there is no such thing as low and higher. But that can lead to premature and erroneous understanding of the roles where we are placed. And this is, perhaps I will take another angle at what you have asked just now, what you have brought into the conversation, alluded to, is the, well, that still brilliance of Jung, Carl Jung, when it comes to some of the suggestions that he, of course, was richly drawing from tantric traditions and from Indian heritage. We know that to be true. And that one of the aspects of which is particularly feels relevant today in our understanding of the relationship, now I will use that metaphysical language and theological language of the West, of God and man. So the audacity of Jung to suggest that it is in man where God become conscious, that, as it were, without man or prior to man, God is unaware, as it were, even of the fact that he is God, but more so remains unconscious. And it is in man that God has the chance, the possibility, the potentiality to become that what he is. And this is very, very Vedic. This is at the greatest koan of all the koans, if we are to give this now frivolous analogy to give this kind of like interpretation. What comes first? You see, this like this chicken and egg story. Is God a concept? Is God a byproduct of some refined thinking? Is transcendence as an experience what gave rise to God? So what here is prior to what? And so this, you see what gives this, that creative tension with the analogy borrowed from Carl Jung's suggestion that the affair of being human is not as straightforward as it seems, is very much Vedic in its essence, because what it here presupposes is that's where the greatest battle always is, and the greatest realization always is. So this premature conclusion of disregarding the polarities, disregarding the low and the higher, can lead to a huge, massive spiritual bypassing. So, in other words, going back to what we touched upon, that what confines an ignorant constantly is the source of freedom for the enlightened. That what in an ignorant is constantly the source of fragmentation is the source of unity for the enlightened. So, up until that is a true state of affair, these dynamics, these interactions of the lower and the higher realm are at play. And we always propitiate something. So, of course, when the water reaches its level, then we know this, and this has been exemplified by many, many outstanding cases throughout history and various cultures where the distinction is abandoned altogether. The most dramatic examples is this or that sage can perform a sacrificial offering with his excreta, with his feces, urine. The sacrificial offering can be performed through the most mundane, or what could be perceived through the eyes of the uninitiated, unworthy, or even a blasphemous act. So we're entering here some really, 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 I don't want to say murky waters, but we're entering some waters which are so deep that if we are to mix up apples and pears too soon, then we will end up with a complete and utter mess. Above all else, mess in terms of this, what is being propagated. So this takes us back in a way what we discussed, that final descent and reclaiming of all the lower energies, lower strata of expression, is what divinizes the matter. That's what Sri Aurobindo talked about, the necessity for bringing consciousness down to the level of matter. He used that language prior to the quantum physics, but that's what, effectively speaking, that is. So therefore, abandoning certain code of conduct prematurely is always on par with contributing to ripping the fabric of how things are. And with all that being said, also what is worthy perhaps mentioning, and that might tie together what you have spoke earlier in terms of collective and individual, and how do we find ourselves in this drama of life, is that whether we know it or not, at the point of polarization, we will be pulled into respectives, to take respective sides. Just as it in every epic, and there is this a moment, there comes a moment when the so-called forces are assembled, and that by virtue of that polarization, before the harmony can be restored, that quickening, that the process of acceleration, because something is out of whack, so acceleration is the result, then one would be propelled to take side, irrespective of whether one thinks one knows which side to take. One is simply being galvanized by the power of where one is, I don't know what we're going to use, karmically or whatever, fate-wise, or where one is find oneself in a given moment in time, just as in the Bhagavad Gita, when they stood opposite, facing each other, what broke the Arjuna's heart, was seeing his teachers, seeing his tutors, well-wishers on the other side of the battle. His own teacher ended up being the opposite, on the opposite side, Drona. So this is how, his own brother, whom he doesn't know, he's a brother, Karna, is on the opposite side. So this is also that invisible side, the invisible aspect that we all play the cosmic drama. So I don't know what it ties in our conversation here, or maybe it's simply what it belongs to. So on one hand, we are like that character, that Oedipus Rex, driven by the desire to know his real origins, who are his real parents. He wants to find truth. In other words, he set on her own to truth only to cause tremendous havoc. And when he knows the truth, it is then accompanied by that act of taking his own side. So he blinds himself, and now he saw the truth. See, so that metaphor he is completed. He is now the one who knows the truth, but he is blind. So that reverse analogy here is very, very startling. And of course, it has to be for the play to carry that creative, cathartic tension there. So the galvanization, the process of polarization, pulls us irrespective of what we think of ourselves. We may want to be on the right side of history. Little do we know that it's all decided.
Yeah, I think this epic that you mentioned hints at something very deep. And just to say another, as I was reading your book, and another word, similar word came to my mind, which is enthusiasm. And enthusiasm has the etymology of entheos, which is also to be possessed by the deity or to be possessed by God. That's a word we often use, but it has that under the deeper meaning
Yes,
is.
well spotted. That's a beautiful analogy. Very beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have covered so much ground, and there is so many rich themes. Maybe to kind of conclude at something that you had prompted me in the beginning to return to, that as we are repossessed by the goddess in this creative process, that our perception is refined. And one thing that I feel in myself is that I have a sort of an amnesia when the jump happens from in this spanda, in this polarization where you go up and you come back down. What happens in between? And in Kashmir Shaivism, and you allude to it in Camatkāra, the levels of or the structures of how this sort of descent happens. And from what I understand to what you write in Camatkāra is that as we go through the spiral again and again, our perception unfolds and we get to see how the descent is happening, what is the structure, perhaps the intermediary steps from Shiva to the individual. Am I correct in my hypothesis?
Well, actually, the very unfolding parts of the Kundalini course, which forms the basis of the book in the making, gives quite a bit of attention to posit ourselves in terms of why Shaivism is called Shaivism. Because it effectively speaking carries this name after this trinity, that three in one, the Shiva, Shakti, Nara, and as that para, and apara, and as that will, knowledge and action, as that knower, knowing and known, as the seer, seeing and seen, or as the knower, means of knowledge, and the known. So all these are modalities of awareness. All these modalities of awareness of the anuttara, otherwise incomprehensible and beyond reach of imagination, thought, feeling. So in a way, that cascading qualities, and this is how I've been speaking about it in several retreats for the past nearly 2 years, to actually even at times graphically give the representation of this with the help, with the assistance of drawings and diagrams, and to give this kind of a physical gesture, physical appearance to this, so as to make it feel more tangible. The Shiva Shakti Nara here is to be seen as not somehow that Shiva becomes Nara, or Shiva or awareness becomes an individual, this in itself presupposes obviously phases of transgression, or phases of, let's say, contraction. Whereas in order to have a more all-encompassing understanding of this, is without these modalities, there is no possibility for experience. And this is where the emphasis have been placed. And I know that for many people this poses, seekers who have heard many spiritual teachers, read on the subject, and poses sometimes dilemma, because I speak about it, there is only experience and nothing else. Whereas many teachers say that experience is only experience and it's gone. And whereas the emphasis here is given that there is only experience. The only true thing here is experience. Everything else is a speculation. Everything else is hearsay. Everything else is hypothesis. So an experience here, of course, that does not confine only to physical, mental experience or emotional experience. The experience of transcendence is an experience. Experience of being nothing is an experience. Experience of complete absorption is an experience. And so this principle of aham here, also in that equilateral of Shiva Shakti Nara, is that supreme mantra of the Shaivites, aham, plays tremendous importance. So this is the Kundalini course unfolds from there. Kundalini course in a way deals with this understanding and goes from there to the understanding of the cascading nature of tattvas, the categories, how these categories are then can be grouped, divided into pure, psychic, and physical. In other words, the where the material creation takes place. So this is the main division between the categories: the pure categories, the intermediate categories as psychic categories, where all the 10 plates laid out, and then the categories of manifested creation with all the Mahabhutas, Indriyas, Karmendriyas, and so forth. So this is what gives us that picture, let's say. But the understanding of how Shiva becomes individual, you see, it can only be truly grasped in a sense that there is no such thing that Shiva becomes an individual. See? It's the modality that is required for experience to take, for experience to be a possibility. So this modality is at play, but the interactions within that modality of how awareness expresses itself is what makes the difference. So in that trinity of the experience, wherever the emphasis is, whatever the emphasis lays, so it's from the extremity, from the extremes of where only individual aspect is being known for being the experience because that's the object of one's experience. So in other words, subject is concealed in the objective sphere of experience. To the diametrically opposite of that, when subject and object become so intimate, they neutralize or annihilate each other, drown in each other. And again, that analogy is only an analogy. So this dynamic interactive, this is how awareness interacts with itself. So for awareness to interact with itself, it requires these modalities of seer, seeing, and seen. So therefore, the cascading of course, in the Kundalini course, the emphasis was given also and always spoken from the different Kundalinis, the Para Kundalini, the Chit Kundalini or Shakti Kundalini, and Prana Kundalini. So it is at the level of the Chit or Shakti Kundalini where that trepidation, that very fine moment where, as it were, the propensity is being defined, decided, like in double split experiment. So if the propensity to remain in union with Shiva, as it were, speaking that more traditional way of the language, using that more traditional way of the language, then it will never manifest. It will be pulled back into Parakundalini. But if there is a slightest, however slightest propensity for manifestation, whatever that may be, instantaneously it cascading itself with tremendous source as Prana Kundalini, with all that universal force. And that's what we then from there on deal with in the course and likewise in the forthcoming book, because when we speak of the manifestation, we speak of Prana Kundalini, because all this manifestation is consciousness in its state as motion, which is prana. So all this, what we speak of, can also be spoken of in terms of prana as consciousness or consciousness as prana. What's the difference? There's no difference, is that consciousness has this aspect within itself, this propensity for motion, propensity for movement. So when that takes over, that's how consciousness is then manifests itself as the world. So in the Kundalini course, we speak about this, and we start the discourse when we tie together the Trika Shaivism, that equilateral, that Holy Trinity, let's call it, with the also triple aspect of the Kundalini as Para, Chit, or Prana Kundalini. So, as you can see here, and if you reflect on this, the individual always, as it were, in other words, Shiva always remains Shiva, even in disguise as an individual. Why? Because that is the power of its own Shakti, which is expressed through pranic force. So it's checked by Kundalini. So Kundalini here is the guardian of individual experience. It is the Kundalini that unravels the individual or contracts the individual. So this is where also now, if we are to kind of leap into, to give it a kind of more of a summary, and that what will help us to have the bridge when we spoke about Samavesha, is why Shiva is the goal, Shakti is the means. So once the Shakti takes over, then it is the Shakti that delivers, and that's Samavesha. That's the process of Samavesha. So individual efforts, as it were, exhausted by then, up to a point at which they are of no use. It's not done by individual efforts. Why? Well, because already you can see that there's a dissipation of energy which fed the structure of the individual. The rug is being pulled beneath one's feet. So this is also, you may ask, or this may bring a question, are all awakenings leading to that equal realization? Are all awakenings of Kundalini will result, you see? Well, it depends. So this is why some people go through Kundalini awakening and they complain that I've never really realized and what I thought that would bring that realization. So this is also now maybe throw here as well. And that's where it also again connects that leaving the paradox already. So that tension then in sincere aspirant, sincere seeker, sincere or finder. So at what point will I not become an individual? You see? At what point? And this can itself serve as a reality check. Well, you will always be an individual. Why? Because you were already at a given, not an individual. So that in itself kind of like cancels, you see, because the equation is looked upon with the wrong kind of set of, I don't know, subtraction. So because we want to experience the cessation of the individual. It can be experienced as an experience. It can be granted. In fact, in Kundalini, very often that is the case. It is something that maybe serve as a landmark. But that in itself is not what would become a predominant state throughout. So the question is then, hang on a second, I had this realization and that realization left. Because I am back to being individual. You see, and this is where the highest understanding is. The highest understanding, that's why Trika Shaivism is also called Secret Supreme. So Shiva conceals, and in a way, in a folk, down-to-earth, simple way, it can be spoken of to peasants, to people who are not educated, not read. Simply, it's understood in the sense of Shiva closes his eye and the world comes into being fully. Worlds and forms and phenomena. Shiva opens his eye and the world ceases to exist. So in other words, this dynamic is at play here. So, and that dynamic is not somehow one is inferior than the other. It is out of its own will. This is the teaching, that consciousness undergoes this transfiguration. And likewise, out of its own will, it goes into that transfiguration where that same force is returned to its source. But that dynamic tension remains there because it's required. The subject-object is where everything takes place. So otherwise, the spiritual teaching will end up, if they are to seek conclusive somehow confirmation that there has to be the state of cessation, then it will be either samadhi and live through the body, or commit seppuku, and cut the life force with the katana, or with the short sword, not katana. Mm-hmm. So, like, if that was the case, then spiritual enterprise would have to culminate in some form of cessation. But it's not. So, this is where we now return back to that, right? Mountain, no mountain, and mountain again. Prior to, in intermediate stages, and then again, mountain comes back.
Yeah, and I remember in our earlier conversation, we were talking about this TV series Avatar, the Airbender.
Yes, yes.
And in that series, I like maybe it connects to this theme that you were just sharing, that there's a definition of what an avatar is in that, which is that he has all of his past life memories invoked and they get channeled like a lens. And so his potential of in this creation becomes supercharged, and so that is like a max empowered being. And I feel like in this spiral, uh, there is a potential for maximum embodiment through some process of integration. So I like that definition, which is a little different than the normal traditional interpretation of what an avatar is.
Mm. Well, Maharishi used to say that if we understand what the term avatar stands, then we all are avatars. Everyone is an avatar. And he used to chuckle with that. So kind of it's the same thing in a way. In potentiality, all of us are avatars. In potentiality, there's nothing other than incarnation. So if we are temporarily experiencing this particular embodiment, that is an incarnation. Is it an incarnation of some important almighty aspect? You see? Again, it depends on how we look at it. In potentiality, it must be. But to what degree that would be realized, that's a different story. Again, if we are to borrow this lore and epics, throughout the Mahavatar's incarnation of Vishnu, the 10 classical ones, the only one that he knew of himself to be an avatar was Krishna. Even as Rama, he was not aware of him being an avatar of Vishnu. It was suggested to him, allusions were given, but he was as if oblivious to that fact. Buddha need to perform all the penances, all these extremes. Why would he do that if he knew he was an avatar of Vishnu? So, in a way, the evolutionary process mapped out by these 10 incarnations of Vishnu, all of them mapped out there, almost from embryonic state, embryonic fish, first avatar of Vishnu, to the Kalki, who's yet to come. That's also very interesting. Yet to come. So in other words, at the potentiality. I remember back in the days, people were like, get super excited, then, okay, well, the Kalki is coming. Or maybe Kalki is among us. No, Sangha is going to be Kalki. No, it's not going to be, this time it's not going to be single individual person. It's going to be like, no, you're missing the point. The point is that the 10th is a potentiality. So the 10th is always coming, always there. No, one of the ways of reading it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think maybe with all these different mythologies, it also alludes perhaps to the word bhavana, the imagination of somehow we imbue it, our belief, our faith has a connection to what can be brought forth.
Yeah, it's quicksilver. This is the quicksilver-like. It's constantly in a molten state. So we bring it forth and dissolve it many times. And what maintains certain form is what maybe there is a certain consistency of that. Who knows? a certain consistency of that, what gives appearance in that matrix. In the hologram, it gives a certain appearance temporarily, like even slow motion camera or something captured. You know, when the water is splashed, it can take form, look like. In time scale, it, you know, but like. And anyways, this is all areas of it's always good to know that certain things also have the taste, the fragrance, and brewing the tea, the temperature has to be right. And certain posture actually assists to the flavor. They say if you sit on your heels and whisk matcha, it tastes better than just slouching on a sofa. And I believe that to be true based on direct experience, that there is something how even our body is being held, how experience differs. So I'm kind of, in my day-to-day life, that's where, in the chaos of the householder, as inevitably bringing up kids, and right now 3 at the same time, see, those moments are rare. So in that chaos, the accentuated point of when you can have that your space, your little kind of repose. See? They don't stand in opposition to each other. One is the continuation of the other, but one marks the other. One can't drink tea all day long or sit in a pose. So this is also something that we shouldn't forget, how all that is beautifully articulated, how the gesture, the movement, juxtaposed to stillness, gives quality to each. And the fact that the incense fizzles away is what makes it ever so more precious when we catch the waft of that fragrance. If it was there at all times, imagine. So what is fleeting here is always a reminder of the eternal. Or so they say.
Wabi sabi.
Yes, wabi sabi.
I learned that from reading your book. Thank you so much, Igor, for being with me. You've given so much time and energy today. So grateful. And once again, your retreats are coming up. You're coming here to the US in September and October. And I think I don't need to ask you what the immersions are going to be like. I think you've shared so much. So I think there is a lot of clarity of what the retreats entail. I would like to join you in October. And yeah, thank you. Domo arigato gozaimashita.
Great. Thank you, Kenan. Thank you. And looking forward to seeing you in California.